Let's set the board before it flips. The precarious post-war balance. Britain's sterling trap, 1945–1955. At the end of World War II, Britain looked like a victor on paper and a debtor in reality. The empire's map still stretched across time zones, but its balance sheet ran through one fragile instrument, sterling. The sterling area, Britain plus much of the Commonwealth, pooled foreign exchange reserves and settled trade in pounds. That kept demand for sterling high and gave London a kind of financial gravity. But here's the catch. The goods they needed most, food, machinery, oil, were priced in dollars. Most people think reserve currency means freedom. In post-war Britain, it meant obligations you couldn't escape. In 1947, London tried to make sterling convertible, letting foreign holders swap pounds for dollars at will. It lasted weeks. Dollars rushed out as counterparties cashed pounds into the scarcer currency. Convertibility was suspended, and the lesson was straightforward. The world trusted sterling for invoices, not for savings, and certainly not against the greenback. The government took the hint, sort of, and leaned on the sterling area to keep using pounds while maintaining exchange restrictions to conserve dollars. It worked, until it didn't. The Marshall Plan papered over the gap. US aid funneled dollars into Europe, and Britain received a large share. That eased rationing and restarted industry, but it also masked a structural problem. Britain's export machine couldn't earn enough dollars to pay for essential imports at pre-war living standards and defense commitments. The dollar gap became shorthand for a strategic dependence. Economic recovery required American liquidity, directly or indirectly. By 1949, the numbers forced a public sacrifice. Sterling was devalued from $4.03 to $2.80. Devaluation helped exports on price, but it dented credibility. Investors now understood that sterling was an adjustable promise. And once you signal that a currency protects employment first and external value second, the market watches your policy mix like a hawk. Meanwhile, British recovery was rationed. Bread had been rationed after the war, meat, petrol, and coal allocations dragged on. The government prioritized rebuilding industry and paying for a global military presence across Germany, the Mediterranean, and Asia. Defense spending wasn't just a budget line, it was a statement of status. But budgets have a way of exposing fantasy. Every pound spent on garrisons and carriers was a pound not spent on modernizing factories to close the productivity gap with the US. Oil turned the sterling trap into a pipeline problem. The Middle East provided cheap crude. British companies had long-term concessions. Tankers fed refineries in Europe. But oil was priced or settled in dollars, and shipping, insurance, spare parts, and many capital goods were dollar-linked too. The Suez Canal sat in the middle of this logistics flow, a shortcut that turned time into cash flow. When crude flows smoothly, your reserve drain is manageable. When they hiccup, your dollar bill rises quickly. Bond markets saw the strains before the headlines did. Gilt yields ticked up when import bills widened the current account deficit or when defense outlays spiked. A country that promises both full employment at home and a global military footprint abroad will either raise taxes, borrow more, or inflate. Britain tried a bit of each, but investors aren't fooled by labels. They watch the arithmetic. As reserves wobbled, the Bank of England defended the peg, spending scarce dollars to keep sterling steady. Each intervention solved the day and sharpened the long-term question. The sterling area itself was a mixed blessing. It created captive demand for sterling, which let London run deficits inside the bloc. But it also meant that if confidence cracked, the liabilities were concentrated. Think of it like a bank with loyal depositors, right up until rumors start. In 1947, the rumor became reality. In the early 1950s, the system held, but it remained brittle. Convertibility was postponed because everyone knew what would happen if it returned too soon. A run, again. Then there's the politics. Britain's leaders understood the optics. The empire's image underpinned the pound, but the causality was reversed. The pound funded the image. When the Korean War flared, rearmament drove spending higher. Growth rose, but so did external pressure. The Treasury managed crises with tools that bought time, Credit controls, import quotas, quiet talks with Washington, and occasional rate hikes. Time is useful if you're catching up. It's lethal if you're standing still. By the mid-1950s, exports had improved, rationing lifted, and living standards edged up. It felt like normalcy returning. Yet under the surface, the constraint didn't change. Britain still needed dollars to keep oil, technology, and certain foods flowing. It still owed the sterling area a safe, stable currency, and it still wore the costs of a global role. That's the sterling trap, power expressed through a currency that can't absorb a shock. Now add two facts. One, the canal wasn't just a waterway, it was a working capital accelerator for Europe's energy. Two, the Aswan High Dam became a geopolitical bargaining chip between Egypt and the Cold War giants. The balance held until one dam and one canal rewired the board. Nasser's gambit, from Aswan Dam to canal nationalization. Here's what actually happens when a mid-tier state plays its hand well. Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted the Aswan High Dam because water and electricity are power in a desert economy. The dam meant flood control, irrigation for millions of acres, and cheap hydro to industrialize. To fund it, he triangulated. The World Bank, the United States, and Britain dangled loans. The Soviets hinted at help if the West stalled. Most people think this was vanity. It was leverage. Whichever superpower financed the dam would shape Egypt's path for a generation. But the talks were brittle. Washington and London didn't just want engineering milestones. They wanted alignment on Israel, on communism, on regional bases. Nasser played for time, buying arms from Czechoslovakia in 1955 to break Western control over his military supply. That set alarms off in Washington. By July 1956, after months of mixed signals, the United States pulled the offer, the World Bank followed, and Britain went with it. Officially, it was about doubts over Egypt's finances and capacity. Unofficially, it was about Nasser's independence. Now, this is important because it created an immediate funding hole and a political opportunity. Nasser needed cash and a narrative. He had both within reach, the Suez Canal Company. The concession, dominated by French and British shareholders, still had decades left to run. Egypt had sovereignty on paper, but not control in practice. Nasser's calculus was simple. If the West won't finance the dam, nationalize the company, use canal tolls to pay for Aswan, and turn humiliation into defiance. On July 26, 1956, in Alexandria, he said the code word, de Lesseps, multiple times during a speech, Ferdinand de Lesseps being the canal's 19th century builder, signaling teams to seize the company's offices. Engineers and administrators were ready. Egyptian forces took control quickly. French and British managers were escorted out. Nasser announced compensation based on the company's recent share price. Legally, he claimed the right of expropriation with payment. Practically, he flipped control overnight. Why then? Timing was strategic. The Anglo-American withdrawal had just landed. The canal was operating smoothly, summer shipping was heavy, and Egypt had trained pilots and staff to keep it running. He also calculated that a dramatic but legalistic nationalization would divide Western opinion. Some would rage over property rights. Others would admit sovereign governments can nationalize if they pay. And crucially, he framed it not as a blow against navigation, but against foreign domination by a company born in the imperial era. His message to the Arab world was clear. Sovereignty wasn't a slogan, it was cash flow. Keep the oil in Arab hands, keep the canal in Arab hands, and you change the terms with London and Paris. In a region still nursing wounds from 1948 and colonial mandates, that resonated. Nasser's Voice of the Arabs radio made it a movement. You can say no, and you can win. To London and Paris, the signal was a red line crossed. The era of concessions and quiet deals was over. If Egypt could rewrite a contract of this scale without Western approval, then every strategic asset in the Middle East looked vulnerable. British leaders talked about internationalizing the canal under the 1888 Convention of Constantinople, which guaranteed free passage. But that convention didn't give them the right to run it. They pressed for a conference, offered proposals, and warned of grave consequences. Markets heard something else. British assets were exposed to a leader who wasn't playing by old rules. Now here's where it gets interesting. Nasser promised compensation and kept the canal open. Ships kept transiting. That blunted the case for immediate force. If the waterway isn't blocked, is invasion justified? But beneath that operational calm sat a deeper break. Control was political power, and the revenue stream no longer answered to shareholders in Paris or the City of London. Egypt's plan was to escrow tolls, pay creditors on their terms, and divert the rest to Aswan. He also understood the West's constraint, law and optics in the United Nations. By nationalizing with a compensation formula, he made it harder to build an international coalition for military action. He bet that Washington, focused on the election cycle and wary of being seen as pro-colonial, would oppose force. That bet would shape everything that followed. Public outrage in London masked a more specific fear: sterling's exposure to a prolonged canal dispute and oil reroutes. Britain could threaten, posture, even plan. But if Nasser kept the canal technically open, time worked in his favor and against sterling. The trap tightened, and the clock started. Secret partners in a public crisis, the Sèvres Protocol. Behind the speeches and UN letters, London and Paris were already in a different room, literally. In late October 1956, senior officials from Britain, France, and Israel met in a villa in Sèvres, outside Paris, to design a war that wouldn't look like one. The goal was blunt: remove Nasser, restore control over the canal's operation, and reassert deterrence in the Middle East. But the method needed political cover that could pass in Washington and at home. That's where the choreography came in. Israel's role was the first domino. The plan called for the IDF to move across the Sinai toward the canal, creating a threat to international navigation. Within hours, Britain and France would issue an ultimatum to both Egypt and Israel to stop fighting and withdraw a set distance from the canal zone. The ultimatum was engineered to be impossible for Egypt to accept, because Israeli armor would be far closer to compliance than Egyptian forces. Once Egypt refused, Anglo-French airstrikes would begin to separate the combatants and secure the canal towns. It was intervention dressed as peacekeeping. Each partner brought different objectives and red lines. Israel wanted to end Fedayeen raids, break Egyptian rearmament, and shatter the Gaza-Sinai pressure on its borders. France, wounded by Nasser's support for Algerian rebels and protective of its Suez stake, wanted regime change in Cairo, or at least a crushing demonstration. Britain's leadership, especially Prime Minister Anthony Eden, talked in terms of Nasser as an aggressor who must be stopped, often invoking parallels to appeasement. But the British Treasury and the Bank of England weren't in that villa. Their red lines weren't about tanks, they were about reserves. The Sèvres talks tried to solve for deniability. No formal tripartite treaty would be shown. Notes would be minimal, signatures ambiguous, and public statements would tell different stories in London, Paris, and Tel Aviv. Even inside the British government, the circle was tight. Many ministers and officials were kept out of the detailed operational pact. That secrecy was a political shield, but it created market risk. If the operation looked staged, and the timing would make it obvious, credibility would suffer in Washington and in the city. Now, this is important because plausible deniability works only if the audience wants to believe it. Eisenhower's administration didn't. The US had warned against using force and pushed for an international solution that acknowledged Egypt's sovereignty while protecting free passage. American diplomats could read the sequencing as well as anyone. An Israeli thrust, followed by a hair-trigger Anglo-French ultimatum, would not look like an accident. The Sèvres calculus underestimated how far the US would go to enforce that line, financially. Inside Sèvres, the partners mapped the clock. Israel would strike first, preferably around late October, when US attention was on the presidential election, but not so close that the fallout would land in voting week. The British and French would mobilize carriers and paratroops, pre-position aircraft in Cyprus and Malta, and prepare civil affairs units for Port Said and Ismailia. The air plan emphasized destroying Egypt's air force on the ground to minimize casualties and shorten the window. Speed mattered for two reasons. limit diplomatic blowback, and keep markets from having time to panic. But here's where it gets interesting. The risk register focused on Arab retaliation, Soviet bluster, and UN condemnation. The financial column, sterling exposure, dollar liquidity, and oil insurance, got less weight than it deserved. French leaders believed they could ride out shocks. Their dollar liabilities were smaller, and they were more insulated by colonial currency controls. Israel expected the operation to be short and decisive, then shift to US-mediated diplomacy. Britain, however, was the hinge. It relied on confidence, not capital controls, to keep sterling stable. That made timing a weapon against London. The partners also bet on Eisenhower blinking before the election. The theory went like this. A Middle East oil shock is bad politics, so Washington would quietly accept a quick fait accompli if the canal remained physically intact. Restore order, present a new regime, or at least an international authority, and let the dust settle. It sounded neat in a briefing. It ignored the administration's Cold War logic, allowing allies to topple a neutral leader by force. In the weak America touted a rules-based order, undermined the narrative with non-aligned states from Asia to Africa. Ike's team prioritized credibility over convenience. Political cover at home was a separate track. In London, Eden framed the impending action as protecting international rights and averting a wider war, language designed to keep moderates on side and to erase the word collusion. In Paris, the message leaned harder: Nasser, the Algerian rebellion, and national prestige. In Israel, the pitch was security, ending a siege economy and opening the Straits of Turin. Each story held pieces of the truth. None admitted the choreography. And there was a quiet misread about markets. The assumption was that a short operation would calm shipping, reassure insurers, and restore normal oil flows. But markets don't only price physical disruptions, they price political sustainability. If the United States withheld support, dollars, IMF influence, and quiet interventions in currency markets, the financial cost of even a clean tactical win could spiral. That scenario was barely gamed out in Sèvres. The protocol sealed the plan. Israel would go on October 29. The ultimatum would follow. Airstrikes and drops would secure the canal zone within days. Then a manufactured pause for diplomacy. On paper, it was a ladder up and a ladder down. In practice, it was a trap with two springs, one in Cairo, the other in Washington. The plan unfolded on schedule, the markets didn't. Operation Musketeer, the 7-day military victory. Once the Sèvres choreography was set, the first move came fast. On October 29, 1956, Israeli paratroopers dropped near the Mitla Pass, while armor pushed across the Sinai from the Negev. The goal was Cairo. It was to unhinge Egyptian positions, cut roads, and force the air war onto Israel's terms. Within hours, the Israeli Air Force was flying suppression missions, and by the next day, Egypt's forward units were in retreat, many falling back in disorder toward the canal zone. Now, this is important because the timing triggered the second act. On October 30, London and Paris issued their ultimatum, demanding both sides withdraw from the canal area that Egypt physically controlled. The deadline was short by design, and when Cairo refused, the Anglo-French air campaign began. The stated aim: separate the combatants and protect navigation. The operational aim: destroy the Egyptian air force on the ground and clear a path for amphibious and airborne landings. British and French pilots hit airfields at Inches, Al Mazar and Cairo West, among others. The plan prioritized runway cratering, fuel depot strikes, and aircraft revetments. Within the first wave, Egypt's MiG-15s and Il-28 bombers were pinned, many wrecked before they could get airborne. That air supremacy changed everything on the ground. When you control the sky, logistics accelerate, and nerves fray on the other side. The maritime piece moved in parallel. Task forces centered on British carriers, Eagle, Albion, and Bulwark, plus French assets, took station off Egypt's coast. Naval gunfire was prepared but used sparingly. Optics mattered. The real thrust was airborne. On November 5, British paratroopers from 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, dropped onto El Gamal airfield outside Port Said, while French paras from the 2E Rep landed in the city. Street fighting followed, short, sharp, and costly in places, but coordinated air cover and naval spotting kept momentum with the attackers. Here's where it gets interesting. The canal seizure mechanics required a narrow dance. You had to secure Port Said and Ismailia quickly, avoid catastrophic damage to the locks, and avoid sinking ships in the channel. The planners believed a rapid lodgement, followed by a thrust south along the canal's western bank, could box Egyptian units away from the waterway. But war rarely follows a diagram. Egyptian forces, though outmatched, fought hard in the urban zones, using barricades and sniper fire to slow the paratroopers. Civilian density raised the political temperature and the risk of images that would play badly abroad. November 6, amphibious landings brought in Royal Marines and French Marines, expanding the perimeter. Armor rolled off LSDs, and the advance began down the canal road. Tactically, it worked. The casualty ratios reflected the asymmetry. Anglo-French forces took relatively light losses compared to the Egyptian units they engaged, and equipment losses were modest. Air cover pummeled any concentration that tried to regroup, and logistical lines from Cyprus and Malta kept supplies flowing. But the clock was loud. Every hour of success on the ground widened the diplomatic firestorm. The United States pushed for an immediate ceasefire at the UN, the Soviets threatened loudly, and non-aligned states rallied behind Egypt's sovereignty argument. More quietly, the money markets were reading the political tape. The faster Port Said fell, the faster sterling slid. It wasn't causation through combat, it was causation through credibility. The commanders felt the squeeze in real time. Orders came with caveats. Take ground, but minimize damage to the canal infrastructure. Press forward, but be ready to pause if a ceasefire hits mid-operation. That's a strange way to fight, moving aggressively while bracing for a whistle you don't control. Still, within 7 days of the first Israeli move, the battlefield scoreboard looked decisive. Sinai mostly under Israeli control, the northern canal zone in Anglo-French hands, and the Egyptian Air Force neutralized. Everything changes when your tactical win opens a second theater you can't bomb. Egypt scuttled ships in the canal to block passage, detonated charges in key spots, and guaranteed no quick reopening. So even a clean military seizure wouldn't restore oil flows fast. And the global spotlight was now fixed on the gap between stated aims, protecting navigation, and the reality of a staged intervention. By the evening of November 6, a ceasefire order was accepted. Troops who trained for a dash to Ismailia were told to hold. The commanders could count secured intersections and captured depots. What they couldn't count were dollar reserves leaving London by the minute. Militarily, Operation Musketeer delivered exactly what its designers promised: a swift, contained victory with limited losses and command of the field. Strategically, it triggered the one battle Britain couldn't win with jets and marines: the run on its currency. Oil stops flowing, the economic shockwave.